Hello everyone, well I'm back again. I hope you enjoy this painting. Having drawn out just a few sketchy lines in a 2B pencil, I pre-wet the sky area and started to flop in my colours. I'm using my dagger brush to start with, but then I go to my large wash brush to get more of the paper covered. I tilt the paper so that I let some of the area run. If I get a little run mark just as that one was there, I just tease it down a little bit with my wash brush. I use the tissue to take out just a little bit of the paint so that I've got a little bit of a glow behind the foliage that I'm now putting in. I'm using my dagger brush and I'm just using the point, and then I go to the side of the brush as well so that I get a different brush mark each time I do that. Now I'm using the drinking straw and I'll just give a quick blow to some of those paint marks. It gives me a nice random grass-like mark. My colours are a mixture of all that I had at the beginning of this video. I'm using degrees of quinacridone gold, cobalt blue, French ultramarine blue, and the permanent rose with cad orange. That's what I get that lovely glowing orangey colour that I'm showing you now. I think you will notice that I leave quite a lot of white paper showing because I think that gives your painting a little bit more life. I don't like to cover that up too soon. It does get covered a lot more as the painting progresses, but at this stage I like to keep little peeps of white paper showing through. Now I'm using my number 8 round brush, which is a Silver Black Velvet brand, and I'm just popping in a few darks, and then I'm using a thirsty brush to take out some directional areas that I might like to enhance later on. Splattering with my number 8 round, and there are fence posts here in the beginning of this foreground of this painting, so it's hard for you to see that right now, but I'm just kind of putting in the background behind the fence posts right now. Some of the fence posts will have some paint on them, and quite a lot of white paper is still showing on the actual posts. Now the shadow colour that I'm using for the base of the fence posts is cerulean blue with permanent rose. I use a spatter by just tapping my brush loaded with paint so I get some little spots flicked onto the surface. I like doing that. It just gives a random sort of mark, and I like that spontaneity in my work. I'm once again coming in behind the fence posts, so I'm using negative painting with all the colours that I mentioned before, but in different proportions, different degrees. Your own colour mixes are going to be different, even though you're using the same tube colours that I might be using now, but we all do slightly different things with our colours, so I wouldn't worry about it that you try to get exactly my colours. I think your paintings are your individual paintings, and that's more important than trying to copy what I'm doing. I'm just showing you technique more than anything. So we're basically just getting the fence posts to stand out by doing some negative painting behind them. And I'm using the drinking straw, I'm using the dagger brush, I'm using a spatter technique. And I'm just, while that paint's wet, I'm fairly safe to start putting in some good strong darks because it's going to dry probably 2 or 3 shades lighter anyway, so I'm reasonably safe. Putting in my shadow colour, my cerulean blue with a little bit of permanent rose, and just to give the fence posts something to stand on more than anything. Don't have them floating around. This is quinacridone gold that I'm just teasing into that wet paint. Now with a wet brush, I just allowed some of that paint to float down to the bottom of my page. And that's just with clean water. That's called a directional drag. I do that a lot with my paintings, and you get a different value when you do that because your water dilutes the paint quite a bit. So once again, while it's still very wet, I'm teasing in some more dark colours, and notice how I just switched the brush from side to side. That's important. Move your wrist around when you're doing trees and foliage so you get a different mark going at a different angle. Too often we forget, if we're right-handed, all our strokes go from right to left, and if we're left-handed, vice versa. So you have to kind of discipline yourself to twist your wrist around. Now I'm working on the actual fence posts, and I want to be careful to still leave a little bit of white within the fence posts because I want them to stand out against the backdrop of the foliage. Don't be too particular about it. Now I'm on the right-hand side of the painting and going to work on these fence posts with the loose wire coming out of them. But I'm not being too fussy about it. I'm just getting in the shadow side of the fence post where I think would be casting a shadow, and gradually working across. Once again, try to leave white on parts of the fence post. You don't want them completely blocked in. You want them to still feel like they're part of this whole landscape. And gradually I just work across this way. It's a little tedious, this sort of painting, for me, because it's not quite as spontaneous as I like. But I'm creating depth, or hopefully I'm creating depth by having one object against another, and light against dark, dark against light. I come back in with my rigger brush and just slightly a little bit more detail, a little finer in my information, the wire, a few textured marks within the fence itself, and I can have more control with the little rigger brush. But I don't want to paint everything in the rigger brush. That's just way too fine a brush for me to be doing too much with. But it's nice to just get a little line occasionally. You don't want to labour too long in one area of your painting too. You want to keep working over the whole composition. If you stay too long in one area, it will become overworked and you'll lose that lovely freshness. So gradually I get the foreground seen to, and now I go back to the left-hand side of my painting and I'll start refining some of these fence posts a little bit more with my rigger brush. Once again, a little bit of texture implied on some of the dark side of the posts, and I've still left a lot of white, you notice. Putting a little bit of shadow here and there just to give them a little bit more form. But I'm not going to get too fastidious with detail. Remember, this is further off in the middle distance anyway. The importance of darks, I think that's something a lot of watercolourists seem to be a little scared of. I often say my students don't want to go to the dark side. But you can see how much more impact your painting has when you do put some darks in. And always be aware that it's going to dry 2 or 3 shades lighter anyway. So it looks very dark when you first put it on, but it might not look quite that dark when your paint is dry. I'm using my shadow blue colour, which is my cerulean blue and permanent rose, and just popping that into some of the areas where I've left whites. And this is one of the important parts of my leaving whites. I can always put paint over those areas, and it makes in my opinion, it makes the painting glow. To have that contrast and a little bit of a colour contrast in the background like that, I think it makes it really pop. Back to my dagger brush, and I'm using a darker shade of the Quin Gold and French Ultramarine Blue, and maybe a little bit of sap green, and just kind of dancing my way through that back line area and pushing those fence posts forward even more. Putting in some stronger darks, mixtures of my blues, my French Ultramarine Blue, maybe a little bit of Permanent Rose. And this is Quin Gold with a little bit of the Permanent Rose mixed into it. Now I want to get the track organised, so I've got some long cast shadows that are coming from the foliage on the back line. Now shadows have a softness to them. Try not to make them too hard-edged. So when you put the shadow down, just loosen it a little bit with some fresh water so it looks a little less contrived. Back to punching it up with a little bit more dark, playing with my colours, having that lovely contrast of the pink against the mauve, against the blue, against the green. You can get all those colours to work together. They're all analogous colours. They're very happy to play together. And you won't get mud if you leave the white of the paper still showing through. And you also work with your darks. Contrast is very, very important, not just colour on its own. You've got to have some dark contrast and some middle values in there to make it really pop. Using a thirsty brush here, just with my round brush, taking out some of the paint. And here I'm using my wash brush and I'm putting in my shadow colours again, my Cerulean Blue and Permanent Rose. I want those fence posts to look as if they're standing in something like sand or earth of some description, so they're not just floating. And just flop a little bit of paint on occasionally, just let the brush drop a little bit of paint onto the surface. It's nice to break up the monotony of some of the strokes by having a spot here and there. This is Cerulean Blue with a little bit of Permanent Rose, only I've gone a little darker. I'm not using quite as much water with it. My dagger brush is wonderful for flicking paint, but sometimes it goes everywhere, so you have to be aware of that. Be ready to just pop a tissue on it and lift out if you get a little overzealous with some of the spots. You don't want to have it looking too crazy. Popping in a little bit of that blue into some of those white areas that I'd left. Now it's just Quin Gold and Cad Orange. A little bit of Permanent Rose mixed into that mixture as well. And I see I'm constantly working up the shadows. I already had put down shadows. They've dried and they're not quite as strong as I wanted, so I needed to give it a little bit more zap. And now I've decided that the background, I wanted to try and link the background behind the foliage that I put on the paper. So I'm using my blue mixture and I'm just coming in with my brush in behind the foliage and being quite strategic where I'm placing it. And that tends to help me make the back line come together. The two halves of the painting start to come together. And here's my finished painting. I hope you enjoyed this demo and please come visit me again. Thank you.